In the winter of 1943, deep in the occupied heart of Europe, the air carried a strange kind of silence. It was not the silence of peace, but of fear and waiting. Inside a dimly lit attic, a man hunched over a small box of wires and tubes, his hands trembling as he adjusted the tuning dial. The faint hum of electricity filled the room. Outside, German boots echoed on cobblestone streets, each step a reminder that discovery meant death. Yet inside that fragile moment, the man pressed a key, and a pulse of invisible energy leapt into the night sky. That signal, whispered across the darkness, carried more power than any weapon in his enemy's arsenal. Across occupied Europe, scenes like this unfolded night after night. Farmers, teachers, and shopkeepers had transformed into secret operators, their homes into hidden command posts. Radios no larger than a loaf of bread became lifelines of rebellion, bridging the distance between hopelessness and strategy. The faint tapping of Morse code replaced gunfire as their act of resistance. Every transmission was a heartbeat of defiance, invisible to the eye yet impossible to stop. While armies clashed in grand battles, these unsung heroes fought their own war, one pulse of electricity at a time. The story of these hidden radios begins not in the noise of the front lines, but in the stillness of fear. After the German occupation spread across Europe, the resistance faced isolation. Messages had to cross borders patrolled by armed guards, through territories where even a whisper of dissent could end in execution. The traditional methods of communication were slow, vulnerable, and deadly. Yet somewhere within that darkness, a new kind of weapon emerged. It was not made of steel or gunpowder, but of sound and secrecy. Imagine being in one of those occupied towns. The night air is cold, and the blackout curtains shut out every flicker of light. In the distance, church bells have long fallen silent, and the sound of a passing patrol breaks the stillness. Somewhere, a young woman kneels beside a wooden crate. Inside lies her radio, a jumble of wires and valves smuggled in pieces and rebuilt by hand. Her fingers hover over the transmitter switch, heart pounding as she listens for the static that will tell her the line is clear. She knows she has only minutes before the German detectors sweep past again. In that fragile window, she sends her message. Short, coded bursts of sound carry through the night like a whisper of rebellion. For those who dared to transmit, time itself became an enemy. The longer a signal stayed active, the easier it was for German detection vans to triangulate its source. Operators learned to work with incredible speed. They memorized entire sequences of codes and practiced in darkness to avoid using lights that could betray their position. When the signal was sent, they would dismantle the radio, hide it under floorboards, and wait in silence for hours. Every second mattered. The air was thick with both fear and determination, a strange harmony that kept the spirit of resistance alive. The risk was total. If caught, there would be no trial, no mercy. The Gestapo made examples of captured operators, displaying their fates as warnings to others. Yet for every transmitter destroyed, another would appear in a different attic or barn. The defiance spread like fire. The Germans could occupy cities, railways, and airfields, but they could never occupy the air itself. The invisible waves belonged to no one, and in that truth lay the strength of the Allied underground network. Each message carried more than military intelligence. It carried hope. To the soldiers stranded behind enemy lines, the faint sound of an Allied reply was proof that they were not forgotten. For families torn apart by war, the signal that reached London or Algiers meant that someone still fought for their freedom. These were not just transmissions of information, but transmissions of faith. In the midst of fear, they gave meaning to endurance. As the war deepened, the silent war of the airwaves became a defining element of the struggle for Europe's liberation. Beneath the surface of grand offensives and strategic bombings, a quieter rhythm of resistance pulsed through the occupied territories. Each operator, each hidden radio, was a small yet vital cog in a vast machine of defiance. The courage required to press that key, knowing what it could cost, stood equal to that of any soldier storming a beach or flying through enemy fire. The story of these hidden radios is not just about machines or intelligence networks. It is about people who refuse to let silence win. In barns surrounded by frost, in apartments trembling under air raids, and in the dim back rooms of cafes, they found the will to keep transmitting. Their voices were never heard, their names rarely remembered, but their signals reached across the impossible. They carried more than messages. They carried the spirit of freedom itself, crossing borders, breaking through interference, and defying the darkness that sought to silence them forever. By 1943, the German war machine appeared unstoppable. From the Atlantic coast to the edges of the Soviet Union, their control extended across vast territories, and their military discipline seemed unbreakable. Their communication systems were believed to be flawless, secured by encryption and guarded by strict protocols. Within the occupied cities, propaganda declared the Reich's power absolute. Radios were confiscated, public broadcasts censored, and even listening to foreign stations could lead to imprisonment. The Germans believed they had silenced every voice of rebellion. Yet in truth, an unseen battle was growing beneath their order. One carried on the faint hum of secret transmissions that defied their authority. The contrast could not have been greater. On one side stood the might of an empire built on precision, fear, and control. On the other were civilians, operating crude transmitters built from scavenged parts, hidden behind false walls or beneath barn floors. The Germans relied on advanced detection vehicles and a vast network of informants, while the resistance relied on intuition, courage, and moments of luck. What the occupiers saw as unshakable dominance was being quietly undermined by invisible hands, typing out codes in the dead of night. Each signal that reached Allied command was a thread unraveling the fabric of German control. Radio detection units, known as Funkabwehr, patrolled the countryside with eerie efficiency. Their trucks, fitted with rotating antennas, could trace signals across miles of open land. When a transmission was detected, the chase began. Within minutes, armed squads would surround a neighborhood, searching house by house. Families would be dragged into the streets, interrogated under floodlights, while the faint smell of ozone from a recently used transmitter still lingered in the air. Yet, time and again they arrived too late. The radios had vanished, dismantled into harmless parts, and their operators had slipped into the shadows. The Germans controlled the land, but they could not control the air itself. Imagine a small French village at dusk. The sun has long dipped behind the hills, and a curfew silences the streets. A single farmhouse, its windows darkened, becomes the center of an invisible confrontation. Inside, an operator leans close to his set, sending out a burst of code. In the distance, a German truck rolls along the dirt road, its radio detector sweeping the frequencies. The moment the operator hears the faint buzz of interference in his headphones, his pulse quickens. He stops transmitting, cuts the power, and hides the set beneath a loose floorboard. The Germans pass by, their detectors scanning for ghosts in the air, never realizing the signal had been there seconds before. This cat-and-mouse struggle became one of the most perilous games of the war. For every hidden transmission, there was a German patrol hunting it. The tension was constant and suffocating. Resistance members learned to recognize the faint whine of detection equipment, to measure time by danger rather than by clocks. Some even operated radios in moving vehicles, sending short bursts while driving along back roads to avoid triangulation. It was a contest of patience and precision, where silence could mean survival, and a single second of delay could mean death. For the Germans, the existence of these hidden radios was infuriating. Every intercepted message meant another failure, another sign that their iron grip was not absolute. They responded with harsher measures. Entire villages were punished if a signal was traced nearby. Suspected operators were executed publicly, their deaths intended as warnings to others. Yet these acts of terror only deepened the resolve of those who transmitted. They understood that every signal, however small, was part of a much larger fight. The Germans could not fathom how their disciplined order was being challenged by invisible waves of resistance. The conflict between silence and sound became symbolic of the war itself. The Germans ruled through fear and control, suppressing speech, censoring thought, and silencing dissent. The resistance fought by restoring voice, even if that voice existed only as dots and dashes in the air. It was a battle of philosophies as much as of technology. Where the Reich sought obedience, the transmitters whispered freedom. Each coded message that slipped through the static was a declaration that control was never complete, and that truth could still travel through the darkness. As the months passed, the Germans intensified their radio sweeps. They deployed more advanced listening equipment, trained specialized teams, and mapped entire regions to locate possible transmitters. But the resistance adapted just as quickly. They shortened their broadcast times, shifted frequencies, and spread operations across multiple safe houses. What began as a handful of isolated operators evolved into a resilient network that could not be easily broken. The harder the Germans tried to clamp down, the more invisible and unpredictable the radio war became. In the end, this unseen conflict revealed a deep irony. The very technology that had once given Germany an edge in communication became a weakness exploited by those they oppressed. Their obsession with control blinded them to the power of small acts of defiance. Hidden radios, simple in design, yet powerful in purpose, became the tools that exposed the limits of tyranny. Against the hum of their own propaganda, another sound persisted, a faint, rhythmic pulse that no amount of fear could silence. That pulse carried messages, courage, and most importantly, the truth that even the most powerful empire could not command the air it breathed. The story of the hidden radios began long before the Allies landed on the beaches of Normandy or the great battles that shook Europe. It started quietly, in the dim offices of intelligence agencies and the workshops of engineers who understood that information could win wars. When the Axis powers spread across Europe, the occupied nations were cut off from one another. Resistance groups that wanted to communicate with the Allies faced impossible odds. Couriers were captured, coded letters were intercepted, and telephone lines were tapped. To survive, they needed a new kind of lifeline, one that could cross borders and front lines without ever being seen. That lifeline was radio. In London, British intelligence officers worked tirelessly to design transmitters that were both powerful and small enough to hide. The earliest prototypes were crude, built from spare parts and military leftovers. But as the need for secrecy grew, the designs evolved. Engineers developed radios that could fit inside suitcases, bread loaves, and even wooden furniture. Some were disguised as harmless household objects, their true purpose known only to the person operating them. The goal was simple but daring: to give those living under occupation the power to send messages directly to Allied command, bypassing every barrier the Germans had built. Imagine a basement workshop somewhere in England in 1942. The air smells of solder and machine oil, and the light from a single bulb flickers against shelves lined with copper coils and vacuum tubes. A young engineer tests a small transmitter, adjusting the frequency until it hums perfectly. Beside him, an intelligence officer takes notes, timing how long the device can operate before overheating. They know that within weeks, this little machine will be smuggled across the channel, hidden inside a crate of medical supplies or beneath a shipment of grain. Once in enemy territory, it will become a voice of defiance, its signal crossing oceans of darkness to reach Allied ears. The people chosen to operate these radios were not soldiers by training. Many were civilians, teachers, mechanics, farmers, and students, recruited by the resistance and taught the basics of Morse code. They trained in secrecy, often in makeshift classrooms or hidden rooms beneath safe houses. Each lesson came with a warning. One mistake could mean death, not just for them, but for their families and neighbors. Learning to send a message quickly, to hide equipment efficiently, and to keep calm under pressure was as vital as knowing how to shoot a weapon. The radio became their rifle, and their signal became their bullet. Across Europe, resistance networks began to form. In France, the Free French forces worked closely with British intelligence to coordinate radio communications. In Poland, underground operatives built their own transmitters from scavenged parts, turning occupied cities into invisible webs of communication. The Dutch and Norwegians followed suit, each group adapting the technology to their terrain and conditions. These networks were fragile but determined. A single broken link could compromise an entire chain of intelligence. Yet they continued to grow, their courage feeding a movement that refused to die. The first messages transmitted from occupied territory were simple, yet monumental. Reports of German troop movements, factory production, or railway schedules made their way across the airwaves, encrypted and disguised within strings of meaningless letters. Each message was received by Allied listening stations in Britain, decoded and relayed to military planners. What had once been isolated whispers of resistance became an organized system of intelligence. The Allies could now see into enemy territory, guided not by satellites or aircraft, but by the bravery of those who dared to send a signal. Every transmission carried enormous risk. The Germans were aware that such radios existed and worked tirelessly to track them down. To evade detection, operators transmitted only for short bursts, never more than a few minutes. They changed locations frequently, using code phrases to signal when it was safe to send or receive. In many cases, entire families participated in the effort. One person kept watch from a window, while another listened for approaching patrols. and the operator, sweating and tense, sent the message that could determine the fate of hundreds. These moments were the heartbeat of a secret world that lived beneath the surface of the war. From the perspective of the Allied command, the establishment of these radio networks was a revolution. Before the war, intelligence often relied on slow, uncertain channels of information. Now, with the push of a key, they could receive reports from inside enemy lines in real time. It was the beginning of a new era of warfare. One fought not only with bombs and bullets, but with signals, codes, and information. The hidden radios had transformed ordinary citizens into vital agents of strategy, giving them a voice that reached across continents. It is easy now to see the technology as simple or primitive, but in 1942, these radios represented the cutting edge of both science and courage. Each one was handmade, tested, and smuggled with the knowledge that it might never return. For every operator who successfully transmitted a message, another would be captured, their equipment seized, their names forgotten. Yet the network endured. The courage that flowed through those wires was stronger than the fear that surrounded it. The origins of the hidden radios were born from necessity, but they grew into something far greater, a symbol of unity across a divided continent. By the time the Allies began planning the liberation of Europe, these transmitters had already reshaped the battlefield. Behind enemy lines, they carried orders, hope, and the promise of freedom. The operators were not simply sending messages. They were building a bridge between the occupied and the free, a bridge invisible yet indestructible. In a world dominated by tyranny, these hidden radios gave voice to those who refused to be silenced. Their quiet signals, flickering through the static of war, marked the beginning of a revolution in both technology and the human spirit. A revolution that would soon turn the tide of history itself. By the middle years of the war, the effects of the hidden radios could be felt far beyond the attics and basements where they operated. On battlefields hundreds of miles away, Allied commanders were beginning to receive intelligence so precise and timely that it changed the rhythm of combat itself. Reports of troop movements, fuel shortages, and planned offensives arrived through coded transmissions from the resistance networks. These messages, often sent under the threat of discovery, allowed Allied strategists to anticipate German actions with uncanny accuracy. For the first time, the fog of war began to lift, replaced by a clarity born not of luck, but of invisible courage carried through the airwaves. Imagine an Allied operations room in southern England. The air is heavy with cigarette smoke and maps cover every wall. A teletype machine clatters softly as a decoded message arrives from a French village deep in occupied territory. The report details the movement of an armoured division toward Normandy, its strength and supply routes. Within hours, the information is relayed to Bomber Command and ground forces. Pilots prepare their missions knowing exactly where to strike, while infantry units shift positions before the enemy can act. The chain begins with a single hidden radio operator, perhaps a young woman hunched over her transmitter in the dark, listening to the faint hum of her signal cutting through static. The intelligence gathered through these transmissions shaped the outcomes of countless engagements. In Italy, resistance networks warned Allied forces of German counterattacks, saving entire battalions from ambush. In the Netherlands, coded messages guided paratrooper drops and revealed hidden supply depots. Even the planning of the D-Day invasion was influenced by the steady stream of information from behind enemy lines. Every message mattered. Each line of code sent from an attic or a forest cabin became a thread woven into the larger tapestry of Allied strategy. What the Germans thought was random misfortune was, in truth, the result of a silent collaboration between soldiers and civilians connected through the hum of radio waves. To the resistance fighters, these radios were more than tools. They were lifelines. The ability to send a message to London or Algiers was a sign that their struggle had meaning, that they were not alone. Many operators described the first time they received a reply as a moment of indescribable relief. The crackling voice or faint Morse signal from across the sea reminded them that their courage had a purpose. In that instant, the distance between the occupied and the free seemed to disappear. The war, so vast and impersonal, became intimate again, reduced to the sound of two signals meeting in the dark. The Germans, unaware of how deep the radio networks had penetrated, began to experience failures they could not explain. Supply convoys were intercepted, surprise offensives met with resistance, and fuel dumps bombed days after relocation. Their sense of control began to falter. German officers grew paranoid, suspecting spies within their own ranks, unaware that the true spy was the air itself, carrying messages beyond their reach. The efficiency of their war machine was being unraveled by signals too small to see, too fast to capture, and too vital to destroy. For the Allied troops fighting on the front lines, the difference was profound. They advanced with greater confidence, guided by intelligence that turned chaos into precision. Pilots flying over occupied Europe knew which bridges to target and which roads to avoid. Infantrymen on the ground received warnings of ambushes that had been radioed from a farmhouse just miles away. It was as if invisible eyes watched over them, whispering truths that could not be shouted. Many never knew the source of this information, but they trusted it, and often it saved their lives. There were moments when the collaboration between the radios and the battlefield reached near perfection. During the liberation of Paris, hidden transmitters guided Allied tanks through the city's narrow streets, helping them avoid German strongpoints. Resistance groups used their radios to coordinate sabotage, cutting communication lines and railways just hours before Allied forces arrived. Each act, each signal, created a pattern of disruption that weakened the German hold and strengthened the Allied advance. The battlefield became not only a place of physical combat but of electronic warfare, where information itself was the most powerful weapon. Imagine being a German commander watching a carefully planned offensive unravel. Orders are clear, troops are ready, but somehow the enemy knows your every move. Bridges are destroyed before your units reach them. Airstrikes hit convoys that were supposed to be secret. Morale begins to crumble. The invisible radios have turned your precision into vulnerability, your strength into exposure. You control the tanks, the guns, the aircraft, but not the knowledge. Somewhere, unseen, someone is whispering through the air, and that whisper is rewriting the outcome of your war. The impact of the hidden radios was not measured only in victories, but in survival. Every intercepted message that prevented a massacre, every warning that saved a village from bombardment, became part of a larger story of defiance. The radios allowed ordinary citizens to influence battles far beyond their sight, transforming them into silent soldiers in a global fight for freedom. The war they fought was not marked by medals or parades, but by brief moments of contact, minutes of transmission that changed the fate of nations. By the time the Allies began to push back the German forces across Europe, the influence of these networks had become undeniable. They had proven that courage and information could rival even the mightiest of armies. The radios had bridged the gap between occupied despair and coordinated resistance, between the isolated and the united. On the battlefield, their signals turned uncertainty into direction, and direction into victory. What began as faint whispers of defiance became the steady pulse of Allied progress, beating across the frequencies of war. As the war dragged into its later years, the invisible pulse of those hidden radios began to reshape more than individual battles. Their impact reached deep into the psychology of both sides, changing not only how the war was fought, but how it was understood. For the Allies, the network of transmitters that stretched across occupied Europe became an invisible artery of strength. For the Germans, it became a source of paranoia and fear. Every failed mission, every intercepted convoy, and every ambush raised a haunting question among German officers. How did the enemy always seem to know? In Berlin, military intelligence departments began to suspect widespread infiltration. Commanders issued new security protocols, restricted troop communications, and even rotated units to confuse potential spies. But the real breach was not among men. It was in the air itself. The Germans could not comprehend that tiny devices hidden in farmhouses and cellars were undermining their massive war machine. Each transmission that slipped through their surveillance was a reminder that total control was an illusion. No matter how many radios they destroyed, new ones appeared like ghosts, rebuilt and reactivated by hands that refused to surrender. The consequences rippled far beyond the front lines. Within occupied territories, the success of the radio networks united fragmented resistance movements that had once operated in isolation. In France, for example, the Maquis groups, once divided by region and ideology, found common purpose through coordinated communication. In Poland, messages from underground operatives allowed them to link with Allied intelligence and plan sabotage missions with strategic precision. Across Europe, the airwaves became a shared language of defiance. Every successful transmission gave the oppressed a sense of belonging to something greater than themselves. Imagine the morale in a small town where the resistance operated. Villagers lived under curfew, rationed food, and constant fear. Yet somewhere, hidden among them, was a radio that spoke to the outside world. When the operator received a coded acknowledgement from London, word would spread quietly from house to house. The Allies were listening. Hope, fragile but real, returned to the hearts of those who had almost given up. These radios did more than pass along intelligence. They carried faith. In a time when speaking freely was forbidden, their signals spoke for everyone. For the Germans, the sense of unease grew. Patrols began random searches, arresting citizens without cause, hoping to find transmitters. But each new crackdown only exposed the regime's insecurity. Civilians began to notice that the occupiers, once confident and methodical, were now suspicious and unpredictable. The invisible war of the radios was changing the power dynamic in occupied territories. The Germans ruled through fear, but now they too were afraid of what they could not see or stop. It was a reversal of control, subtle yet devastating. The Allied command understood the power of this psychological shift. They encouraged the expansion of the networks, providing resistance cells with better equipment and more secure encryption. The more Germany tried to silence the airwaves, the louder the defiance became. Each act of repression only fueled further communication. Entire communities became watchful allies of the radio operators, hiding them, protecting them, and sometimes dying with them. The fight for information had evolved into a fight for dignity itself. The wider consequence of the radio war was not only strategic, but cultural. It taught those under occupation that even the smallest act could carry immense weight. A few seconds of transmission could alter the fate of an army. A handful of words, translated into Morse code, could save hundreds of lives. This realization gave birth to a new kind of courage, the courage to act in silence. The war had turned ordinary people into instruments of history, and in doing so, it had blurred the line between soldier and civilian. In the broader theatre of global strategy, the effectiveness of these radio networks shifted Allied planning. With a clearer picture of German logistics, resources could be redirected efficiently. Missions that once depended on guesswork became calculated strikes. The Allies began to treat information as a weapon, giving rise to the intelligence-driven warfare that would define the modern age. The hidden radios were no longer just tools of resistance. They were prototypes of a new kind of power, one built not on size or firepower, but on knowledge. For the people of occupied Europe, these changes were felt in everyday life. German propaganda, once deafening, began to lose its credibility. Every successful Allied maneuver, every unexpected bombing of a military site, was silent proof that the resistance's messages were being heard. Civilians began to look toward the skies differently, not only in fear of air raids, but in hope that liberation was drawing closer. The unseen messages of the radios gave shape to that hope, transforming despair into anticipation. Yet, perhaps the most profound consequence was moral. The radios reminded humanity of something essential, that truth, even when whispered, has power. The Germans could control newspapers, schools, and public broadcasts, but they could not dominate the truth carried through static. The people who risked everything to send or receive those messages reaffirmed the value of free thought in an age of enforced obedience. They proved that resistance was not just an act of violence, but an act of communication. As the invisible war continued, the air itself became a battleground for belief. The Germans sent jamming signals, flooded frequencies, and executed countless searches. But still, the faint rhythm of resistance persisted. Each signal that survived the noise was a small victory. Each operator who lived long enough to send another message was a hero unseen. The hidden radios had transcended their original purpose. They were no longer simply channels of military coordination. They were the heartbeat of a continent refusing to die. By 1944, the consequences of this invisible rebellion had become undeniable. Allied advances were guided by intelligence gathered from the very people the Germans had tried to silence. The occupiers' own propaganda began to sound hollow, drowned out by the truth carried across the air. Entire nations, once muted under occupation, had found their voices again, thin, crackling, and full of static, but unmistakably alive. The wider impact of the hidden radios was not measured in decibels or frequencies, but in the way they rekindled belief. They proved that freedom could still travel through the air, no matter how tightly tyranny tried to contain it. By the closing years of the war, the tension between the Germans and the underground radio networks reached its breaking point. The silent struggle that had once flickered faintly in the shadows now erupted into a full-scale campaign of fear, secrecy, and survival. The Gestapo, realizing the scale of the resistance's communication web, intensified its efforts to crush it entirely. Patrols swept through villages, house by house, carrying mobile detection units capable of tracing signals with ruthless efficiency. Whole neighborhoods were locked down at the faintest sign of a broadcast. The occupiers were no longer hunting soldiers, they were hunting sound itself. In those final months, sending even a single transmission became an act of near-suicidal bravery. Operators knew the enemy's ears were always listening, and each click of the transmitter key could be their last. Imagine a man alone in a dim attic, his hands trembling over his set as the walls shake from distant artillery. He knows the Germans are closing in, yet he sends his final message anyway, a short, coded warning that an enemy convoy is moving north. As he finishes, the door downstairs bursts open. He hides the set under the floorboards, whispers a silent prayer, and waits. Outside, the trucks grow louder. Inside, the radio's faint warmth fades, as if it knows its task is done. Despite the dangers, the radio networks did not die. For every operator captured, another stepped forward. For every transmitter destroyed, another was rebuilt from scrap. The resistance had learned to survive through constant movement and adaptation. Radios were hidden inside hollow logs, buried in gardens, even disguised within church altars. Messages were sent from rooftops and forest clearings, from barns miles apart, making triangulation nearly impossible. The Germans grew more desperate, unable to comprehend how something so small, so invisible, could defy them so completely. The Invisible War reached its most critical moment in early 1944, when the Allies prepared for the greatest invasion in modern history, the liberation of Western Europe. D-Day depended on secrecy and timing, and the hidden radios became the arteries of the entire operation. Weeks before the landings, operators across France began transmitting coded updates to London, information on weather conditions, troop concentrations, and supply routes. Some messages confirmed the destruction of key bridges or rail lines, vital to slowing German reinforcements. Every signal helped shape the invasion's success. The operators did not know the full scale of what they supported, yet their transmissions became the whispers that guided an army. In those days, the danger was unbearable. The Germans knew something was coming. Their detectors scoured the countryside relentlessly, their soldiers raiding houses, barns, and even hospitals in search of transmitters. Many operators were captured and never returned. Yet their last transmissions went through, carrying the words that would change history. Some sent coded signals embedded in civilian radio broadcasts, hiding instructions for the resistance inside song requests or harmless-sounding chatter. Even in captivity, a few refused to reveal their codes, choosing silence over betrayal. The Germans could break bones, but they could not break the will that powered those signals. Then came June 6, 1944. As Allied ships crossed the Channel, the hidden radios came alive across occupied France. Operators transmitted constantly, relaying German troop movements, guiding paratroopers through the darkness, and confirming which bridges were still intact. In some towns, entire networks operated in concert, their signals bouncing through the air like a symphony of defiance. Resistance fighters sabotaged roads and railways exactly as the messages had instructed, isolating German forces and clearing the way for the Allied advance. The Germans, overwhelmed and confused, could not understand how the enemy seemed to anticipate every move. The answer, once again, was in the air. The success of D-Day marked the culmination of everything those hidden radios had fought for. Their signals, once faint and fragile, had become the backbone of a coordinated revolution. Allied generals praised the accuracy of the intelligence, acknowledging that many operations would have failed without it. Yet the true credit belonged to those nameless men and women who had sent their final transmissions in silence, never knowing the difference they had made. For them, victory was not celebrated with cheers or flags, but with a brief flash of light on a transmitter panel, a hum of energy disappearing into the ether. As German control collapsed, their last desperate attempts to jam the frequencies proved useless. The airwaves, once filled with static and fear, now carried the sound of liberation. Operators who had once whispered into their sets could finally speak freely. Some stepped out of hiding to see Allied soldiers marching through their streets, unaware that their invisible work had helped pave the way. The climax of the radio war had ended not with an explosion, but with a signal, a simple burst of sound that had bridged the gap between oppression and freedom. In the quiet aftermath, many of those radios were found where they had been hidden for years, under floors, inside walls, buried in fields. Some still bore the fingerprints of their last operators. They stood as silent witnesses to the courage that had pulsed through their circuits. Each one told a story of sacrifice and resistance, of lives spent in darkness so that others could live in light. The invisible war had reached its end, and its victory was written not in smoke or gunfire, but in the quiet rhythm of code that had once carried across the night. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the world emerged from darkness into a fragile light. Cities lay in ruins, nations were exhausted, and millions mourned their dead. Yet among the rubble of war, hidden beneath the surface of victory, were the remnants of the invisible struggle that had helped bring it to an end. In barns, cellars, and forgotten attics, Allied soldiers and local villagers discovered the secret transmitters that had once pulsed with defiance. Dusty, silent, and scarred by years of use, they stood as small memorials to the bravery of those who had risked everything to keep the lines of freedom open. Each radio told a story. Some were found still connected to their wires, as if waiting for one last message. Others were buried under loose floorboards, their wooden casings stained with age and fear. Many of their operators were gone, captured, executed, or simply lost to time. But their voices, though never recorded, had left an indelible echo. The signals they had sent in secret now lived in the open pages of history, a reminder that courage is not always loud. Sometimes it is a faint hum in the dark, carrying truth where it is most needed. For the Allied command, the full extent of what the hidden radios had achieved only became clear after the war. Reports and decoded archives revealed that hundreds of critical missions had been guided by information from resistance operators. The success of D-Day, the liberation of Paris, and countless smaller victories had all depended on those unseen transmissions. The intelligence gathered by ordinary people armed with nothing more than a transmitter and hope had saved thousands of lives. The war had proven that the fight for freedom was not won by soldiers alone, but by the combined strength of countless invisible hands. Imagine, in the years that followed, the world beginning to rebuild. Factories reopened, children returned to schools, and families pieced their lives back together. Yet for those who had been part of the radio networks, peace carried a strange silence. Many found it difficult to speak about what they had done. Their missions had been secret, their courage known only to a few. But when they gathered in quiet reunions, sharing memories over coffee or a glass of wine, they spoke of the fear, the exhaustion, and the moment of relief when a signal finally went through. To them, that small click of the transmitter key had been the sound of resistance itself. Governments and historians would later recognize the immense contribution of these networks. In France, monuments were raised to the agents of the radios clandestines. In Poland, museums preserved the homemade transmitters that had once carried messages under Nazi rule. In Britain, intelligence archives were finally declassified, revealing the scope of the Special Operations Executive's coordination with resistance groups. Across Europe, the legacy of the hidden radios became a testament not only to ingenuity but to the enduring spirit of defiance that technology had made possible. The lessons of that invisible war extended far beyond the 1940s. Military strategists began to understand that communication was not merely support for warfare, it was warfare itself. The hidden radios of World War II had ushered in a new era where information could defeat even the most powerful armies. From the Cold War's coded transmissions to the modern world of satellites and digital networks, the principle remained the same. Whoever controls the flow of truth controls the future. The bravery of those early operators had set the foundation for this new kind of power, one measured not in weapons, but in words and signals. For the people who had lived under occupation, the memory of those radios became something deeply personal. They remembered how, in their darkest nights, a faint signal had meant that the world still cared. The sound of static had been a heartbeat of hope, a promise that liberation was coming. Parents told their children stories of secret messages sent from barns, of brave men and women who risked everything to whisper freedom into the air. Those children grew up in a world built by those sacrifices, their lives shaped by messages they would never hear but would always owe. As decades passed, the last of the radio operators grew old. Their hands, once steady over the transmitter keys, now trembled with age. Some of them kept the old devices as mementos, stored carefully in boxes or displayed on mantles like relics of a quieter kind of heroism. When they spoke about the war, their voices carried no bitterness, only the solemn pride of knowing they had made a difference. They did not fight with guns or tanks, but with signals that carried across the unseen. They had proven that even in the face of overwhelming power, a whisper of truth could outlast the roar of tyranny. Today, those radios rest in museums and private collections. Their wires cold, but their stories alive. Visitors lean close to the displays, listening to old recordings of Morse code beeping faintly through speakers. It is easy to imagine the fear and resolve that once filled the rooms where those sounds were born. The codes may no longer carry orders or warnings, but they still transmit something timeless. A reminder that freedom depends not only on strength, but on the courage to speak when silence is demanded. The hidden radios of World War II changed the course of history, but their greatest legacy is human, not technological. They proved that communication, at its core, is an act of faith. To send a message into the void, trusting that someone, somewhere, will hear it, is an act of hope that transcends war and time. And so their signals still echo, faint but unbroken, through the memory of humanity. They whisper a lesson as old as conflict itself, that truth, once spoken, can never truly be silenced.